Okay, so now officially, welcome. This is our penultimate meeting in a way, or actually penultimate lecture. So the final lecture will be about the course wrap up. We will go through one exam together. We will do it together, and you will be able to also ask, questions, ask for clarifications, provide additional feedback. So it will be focused really on the final exam. But I decided today to make a small change in the schedule. We are not canceling anything. It's just that I was thinking about it, and maybe contact-induced change actually has more relevance for the topics that we've covered so far. So borrowing and semantic change. So we are just flipping the order, because grammatical change is really separate from everything. And of course, the big thing for today is assignment number 2, which will be given and explained momentarily. So this is our 8th class, and today you will hear about the assignment. We'll get rid of some loose ends from last 2 weeks, especially the exercise on borrowing, which I forgot that we haven't finished, and you should have told me. And then we'll deal with contact-induced language changes. So the big question, the first on the agenda, assignment number 2. The assignment number 2 is about, as it's written here, the central part of the course. So you are supposed to write a small, let's say, list of examples that explain analogical change, each type of borrowing, and semantic change. So this is due by January the 17th. You see, it's flashing there at the bottom. So today is I think it's the 8th of December. So you have plenty of time, but don't get too comfy, because, the season that's coming is about relaxing and not doing anything, binge watching. So you can use any of your mother tongues, so Serbian, Hungarian, but of course, since I don't speak Hungarian or Slovak or other languages spoken in Vojvodina, you should in that case provide explanation in English. And of course, everything is written in English. So it can be any example of analogical change, including folk etymology and even blending, although it's controversial, an example of each type of borrowing, and some sorts of semantic change, including, for example, metaphor and metonymy. I know that you are probably, full of questions right now, and you want to ask, but before you ask, I was thinking about this, and I decided to give you a sample of what it looks like. So you have a sample of assignment 2 from one of the previous generations in Google Drive on our website. It's available, and let's take a look at it. So actually, let's look at it right now. I think that you should be able to see, instead of the presentation, the website. So this is this is the website of our course. So below the lectures, there is the Google Drive, which you know, of course. So first of all, there's the assignment that I also uploaded today. There were some assignments that were missing due to those Google issues, so it took some time to find out whose work was deleted and to get it again. Nonetheless, I don't know if that's because, it's pandemic and you cannot travel, and you are focused now on your work, but this is the first time that everybody passed this assignment. So you all had really wonderful trees, and some of these trees, I don't want to pick out anybody in particular, because you all did a great job, but I will probably use some of your trees from this year as examples for the next year. Really, I enjoyed it a lot. I was checking it, of course. It took some time, but really virtually no errors. And if there are some errors, they were really minor. So great job. So you can find it there. If somebody is not listed here, it means that I couldn't figure out where your assignment was saved. So just send me an email and we will fix that. But yeah, let's go back. So at the bottom of the Google Drive with today's date, you have assignment number 2 sample. It's here. You can even use this as a template if you want to. So of course, header is Introduction to Historical Linguistics, winter semester, your surname and name, assignment number 2. And for example, this was, let's say, a good but not perfect. So I think this is the best kind of example that we should give. So a very good but not perfect assignment from one of the previous generations. Analogical change, blending. Dobit ću taxicardiju. Very nice blend, very nice blend. And the whole point of this assignment number 2 is actually, first of all, for you to memorize different forms of analogical change, borrowing, and semantic change. But more than that, you are actually learning here and you are revising how to write those short descriptions that you have to provide in the written exam. So this is a good explanation. Blending is a type of analogical change that involves combining pieces of 2 or more words in order to create a new word. In this example, the word taxicardia is a blend of 2 words, taxi and cardia, and denotes a hard condition brought about by the increased speed at which a taximeter runs. So very good, you defined it. You explained it, and you explained you explained the words, but also you explained the meaning, the new blended meaning. Borrowing, need, and it's nice. That's why I chose this example. It's nice if you maybe choose a word that is not necessarily from English. So here you have lasagne. So that's, of course, Italian. And just mention, as you know from the courses from Professor Percic, that you should mention the degree to which the borrowing, when you talked about Anglicisms, they are just a subtype of borrowings. They are borrowings from English. So the word has been morphological and phonological adapted to Serbian, just mention it. Prestige, this is so-so. You can find a much better word, but it's true that emigranti is more prestigious than iseljenik. So, I mean, this was a good example, but not perfect. There are much better examples of prestige in Serbian, especially if you try to find, you know, recent English borrowings. Negative evaluation. So this is from Austrian German. Spitzel means spy. So this is a negative evaluation that those people were spying for the Germans, and therefore refers to shifty and nosy person. And finally, you see this person chose to deal with a metaphor in semantic change. You don't have to choose metaphor. It could be metonymy, could be narrowing, could be widening, could be negative evaluation, could be, in other words, you know, pejoration or amelioration, up to you. But this is a very famous example. I think you also discussed this word in English with Professor Prčić. So head, or in Serbian glava, is really a treasure trove of different semantic changes and various meanings that you can get from one and the same root. So this is a sample, but you can use it as a template. This is a docx file, so it's a Word file, although it's in Google Drive. So you can download it, just turn off the sample watermark. Or actually I can do it. Yeah, I can do it myself. I will upload the new version without this sample, maybe, yeah. Or I can show you how to do it. Yeah, let me show you how to do it, because well, we have to be multitasking, and we expand our knowledge in different domains. So any questions? Unmute yourselves. Anything that is not clear, requires additional clarification, etc. Please, the screen and the mic is yours. So here it is.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So how many examples do we have to use or like find? Is there a certain number, amount, or how many we like?
Well, at least one, of course, but you will increase your chances of, having a super pass grade if you put more than one. But here, actually, as you can see, it's always one. So one example for analogical change, one example for each type of the borrowing, and one example for metaphor. And that's your task this year as well. So you should provide one example of analogical change, any analogical change. So you don't have to provide an example for each analogical change. You choose just one. For borrowing, you list actually all three types of borrowings. And for semantic change, again, one of your choosing. But for example, if you choose metaphor, you can give two different words that show metaphorical semantic change. So that's okay. Yeah. Oh, but on the other hand, don't write your MA thesis. You will do that in a year or two if you decide to go to enroll in MA program. So 2 pages, 3 pages, that's more than enough. 2 pages, as you can see here, not even full pages, that's already quite okay. This was a pass, of course. This is quite good.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So when you download this, you see here there's this sample written all over the place. So you can delete the sample. This is still read-only because I didn't save it as a new version, but that's actually how you find it. So you just type in watermark and you click on remove watermark. If you don't have the new versions of MS Office, then you're not in the luck, because I don't know where it's actually located, but in these new versions of Office, always use the search, and you just click on watermark and you choose remove watermark. If you want to create a watermark, use the other option, but it's very easy. So when you download it, open it in MS Word, and if you have a very old version, when I say very old, it means 2011, everything after that has a search option for commands, then Google is your friend, but you shouldn't be using 2011. It's no longer supported. So that's the explanation. I think it's quite straightforward. So you can use this document, just delete the watermark, and of course put your name and surname, and that's it. Okay, if there are no additional questions, I think we can then move to what we can call, a changed order also in the lecture. Normally we do practice at the end, but now I thought that we should, get rid of the loose ends from previous classes. And once more, I apologize, we didn't finish the borrowing exercise on 20th century loans. You probably remember these slides. So 20th century loans identified the original meaning in the donor languages. We started it, but it completely slipped my mind that we didn't finish it. And these are some really good examples. They're all from Campbell's book. So I think we did the first 3 or 4. So apartheid, taken from Afrikaans, we mentioned it. I think we stopped at Kung Fu. Oh no, we stopped at robot. Yeah, I actually wrote it down because I watched my own videos, which is weird. I hate my voice. So apartheid comes from Afrikaans for separation. So this is the reason why borrowings are so specific. So borrowing always includes some sort of a semantic change. And the change is usually narrowing, so specialization, or in some cases it's pejoration, and some cases amelioration. Very rarely does it actually end up in generalization, but it's possible. So in this case, it's of course both narrowing, and this is, we shouldn't call it pejoration, but this word nowadays has a very negative connotation in the sense that it's a racist term. So chow mein originally did not mean stir-fried noodles with meat or vegetables. It was simply fried noodles. So in this case, the opposite of what I just said happened. So here we had a broadening of meaning. But for example, Kung Fu, which we also did, was of course against specialization. It's actually skill or art. And finally, the one which we did also 2 or 3 weeks ago was robot. Robot was created as a term in fiction writing, and it originally meant somebody who does compulsory labor. So it was first recorded in 1922, and of course here it has a it has a slightly relevant meaning to the original one, but it denotes actually a machine that we treat as a slave who does compulsory labor for us as human beings. But when the AI becomes all powerful, yeah, tables will be turned. So this is the one which we haven't done. Do you know what avant-garde, exemplified here with these weird hairstyles, originally meant in French? If you speak a little bit of French, the word is, super transparent. Anybody speaks French?
It was maybe like before time, ahead of its time.
In English, that's the basic meaning, that it's ahead of time. But in French, it's literally advance guard. This avant-garde is simply advance guard. So that's where we got in English the ahead of time meaning. So it's really interesting how in borrowings you always have a degree of semantic change. No borrowing is completely, taken in the original sense. I mean, there are those that fill lexical gaps that are really necessary, like automobile, hamburger, etc. But very often, especially in English, in those old borrowings, like avant-garde, you have a change in meaning. Now, this will be a real surprise. Again, if some of you speak French, you may know what it originally means in French. Okay, it requires that you know a little bit of the history of word in French. What if I tell you that it's actually related to Greek apotheke? So it comes from botika, and Greek apotheke, which is just a storehouse. So now you cannot imagine anything more fashionable than a boutique, right? That's where you deal with high fashion. But originally, it was simply a storehouse, something where you stored products to be sold. Okay, any ideas on camouflage? You see here a frog. I hope you see the frog. It's well camouflaged. Can you guess the original meaning? It was not specialized.
Disguise, maybe?
Exactly. It means original meaning in French is disguise. And it was recorded first in English in 1917. Now, there's a word also that Campbell introduced to the exercise that we also dealt with in the first year when we talked about irregular plurals. So chassis and chassis has the same spelling. And here, there's a photo which I should have shown in the first year when we discussed this word, because I remember, not in your generation, but I know that there was one generation where nobody really knew what chassis is. This is chassis. So this is, let's say, the skeleton of the car, the skeleton of a vehicle. It can also refer to the boat, and Formula One cars, of course, also have chassis. So any idea what it actually means in French? Okay, yeah, French is not the most popular language, but this is again an example of truly remarkable specialization, because in French it means frame. As simple as that. Any frame, even a frame for a painting. Now, something that is in Serbia still open, but working only until 5. In some countries, it's closed. Cinema. It's borrowed from French, but the original word is actually, can be traced back to Greek. How come Greek? Well, Latin was influenced by Greek. So there were many Greek borrowings in Latin, and then Latin was the, let's say, mother tongue for all Romance languages, so it can ultimately be traced to the Greek root. In French, you have to go into history to find the original meaning, but the original meaning is, believe it or not, just move. So cinema is a moving entertainment, in a way, moving in that it shows movement. Again, another place that's usually closed these days, a discotheque. Here, I think this is, from the 70s, John Travolta. I forgot what movie this is taken from, but so 70s. Disco music, nightclub where music is played, disco music. And this is actually where disco got its roots, because in discotheques you could hear that kind of music, so we called it disco music. But back then, it was not necessarily always called disco. It was just dance music as opposed to rock and pop. So, do you know maybe what it means? It's similar to apotheke. So discotheque in a way is, the same pattern. So you remember, apotheke was a storage facility for something. Discotheque is a collection of records. So when you in the original meaning, it was simply a place where they had a nice collection of records, and they could, if they had 2 turntables like DJs have also to this very day, you could swap the LPs and play back some dance tunes. again from French, and yeah, French is not our, let's say, most popular language in Serbia. So this word, we also did it in the first year. Fuselage refers to the main frame of the airplane without the wings. So fuselage is this central part. In Serbian to bi bio trup aviona bez krila. In French, it means something that is spindle shaped, believe it or not. Very, again, good example of specialization. So fundamentally, what this exercise gives you for the final exam is a bunch of excellent examples of also semantic change of specialization that occurred in the process of borrowing. Garage is French, and of course we know what it means. We also took it from French. In this case, we all borrowed from French throughout the world. It's simply a place where a moving vehicle is kept safe while not in use. And when I say a moving vehicle, it's actually a car, of course. But originally, believe it or not, it had nothing to do with cars. In French, it was the word which was initially used only for boats, and it meant to dock a boat, and many people think that it was possibly related to guard or ward. So you see, again, very interesting specialization. Limousine is like Champagne. It's actually a region in central France. So this is an example of metonymy. So this is not narrowing, widening, or anything. This is an example that is identical to the one we did with Champagne. Now this one is my favorite. Sabotage, of course, means to, prevent the positive outcome for your enemy. It means to, conduct clandestine activities so that you prevent your enemy or opponent of winning the battle, competition, etc. In French, it has the most amazing meaning. Again, because French is not our good, the favorite language, your silence tells me that you don't know the meaning. It really means to walk noisily, believe it or not. So that's actually, I think it's perfect example of the semantic changes that happen in the process of borrowing. So this is the extreme example of sabotage, of semantic change, of narrowing and specialization. Because in the war, if you walk noisily and your enemy could hear you approaching, if you did it on purpose, you actually did an act of sabotage. So it's perfectly clear how it came about, but it's still amazing. And that brings us to finally some other languages. So you know about Blitz. It was a Blitz campaign, a Blitz attack, or a media blitz by the politician running for re-election. So blitz is, in English at least, either a military attack, which is very sudden and not announced to the enemy. It can be also fast and powerful effort. So, for example, if you watch the news, you can hear that before he contracted COVID, Rudy Giuliani was conducting a legal blitz across the United States, trying to overturn the outcome of elections. So generally, a sudden attack or powerful effort. In German, you can guess. For German, I'm pretty sure you know what it means. We have the same word, but in a different meaning, of course. In Serbian, it's the flashlight, right? To je blic na aparatu, ovom fotoaparatu. But the original German meaning is contained in this English word which I mentioned, flashlight. So original German meaning is flash, or lightning. So munja, grom, the phenomenon that you have on shown on the screen. So this is another example of heavy specialization. Some words that were taken from German are not so nice, so they are usually related to the Second World War, in English at least. So Nazi, you know what Nazi means. There are Nazis all over the internet. For example, especially in the United States, now there are some extreme right-wing groups that are labeled as neo-Nazi organizations. But if you watched movies about the Second World War, the rise of Hitler, you probably know what Nazi originally means. Nazi was a short form for anybody?
National Socialism, something like that.
Yes, in this case, a person, National Socialist. So National Socialist, or in German, Nationalsozialismus, it was shortened to Nazi. So, you know, Nazi in German is now, Nazi in German refers, of course, to members of the National Socialist Party, who was headed by Adolf Hitler. But in English and throughout the world, it broadened its meaning to every kind of a political movement or a group who is based on hatred towards the other and intolerance, etc. And again, German words, as I mentioned, usually got borrowed into English over the period spanning the beginning of the 20th century and ending with the Second World War. So these are usually some, let's say, engineering terms and mostly military terms and terms related to the Nazi regime. So snorkel. Snorkel in Serbian, of course, disalica. This is a nice example where, some people say dihalica, but whichever term you use, in Serbian, it's actually a translation, a very good translation, a new word that was created. In English, they took a military term. Can you guess where snorkels were originally used in the military?
Navy.
Navy. So this thing that that went out of the submarine and was below, above the surface of the sea, that was a snorkel. That was not the periscope. The snorkel was actually an air shaft, so that the engine inside the submarine could operate, the internal combustion engine. So it was related to snout in German. So that's actually, you know, they took the air shafts of submarines to mean a thing which you use for snorkeling. The whole activity that you do, like, you know, snorkeling, you want to go to a fancy destination, do some snorkeling. Actually, the word is extremely military in its original meaning. Other examples include, for example, schnitzel, you know, schnitzel, which was just also taken from German, and it was actually a cutlet, not a schnitzel. It was a cutlet, etc. But let's look at some other examples. So from the Hawaiian native indigenous languages, English borrowed the word aloha, right? And here you see the traditional aloha dance. But aloha originally means love, affection, and pity. It doesn't have a lot to do with the current meaning of aloha. And even a better example, again from the Hawaiian languages, is lei, which is the most, recognizable thing that you get when you land to Hawaii. I haven't experienced it myself, but some friends of mine who went to Hawaii tell me that when you land, they actually sometimes give you this when you start deboarding and you're on an international flight. Originally, it's just a necklace, any necklace, not a necklace made of flowers. It's any necklace, even the one which I showed you. The interesting, let's say, word, which is very popular in music these days, is ukulele. A small guitar, a musical instrument. In Hawaiian, it means a leaping flea. The only, let's say, explanation that we have for this is that the sound that you can make on ukulele sometimes resembles the sound of the leaping flea leaping to find the next host, because leaping flea is a parasite. The word kibbutz is probably familiar to you because it's irregular. The multiple instances of this word are irregular in plural. So you say kibbutzim. We did it in the first year in grammar 1, gay one. Original meaning in Hebrew is actually gathering. So not really a community of people living and working together, but actually just a gathering. So even, if you are a member of the Jewish community and you borrow from your, let's say your original mother tongue, in the borrowing, you change the meaning. And in Italian, we didn't only get borrowed words for music. Unfortunately, we got, again, some negative words such as fascism. Believe it or not, originally in Italian, it was a bundle. Bundle that was then interpreted as something that is used to associate somebody with a group, and then we got fascism as the current term in English, because they were people that were fascists. They were within the same group. And the word partisan, original in Italian, is simply a partner, your brother in arms. So there are many other examples. That pasta in Italian also came from dough, has nothing to do with real pasta. Pizza originally is a cake or a tart. And the Japanese examples are amazing. So bonsai is completely non-transparent in English, but in Japanese, it literally means pot and plant. And kamikaze is, of course, a suicidal pilot who will sacrifice his life in order to damage US aircraft carriers or ships. But in Japanese, maybe if you watch movies, maybe you know. Does anybody know? It's a very interesting word. I mean, in the original meaning.
Isn't it like divine justice or wind or something like that?
The second one, divine wind. believe it or not, it's divine wind, because they coined this word. It didn't exist in Japanese before the Second World War, because they wanted to find as many young people who would be willing to do this. They were divine wind that was supposed to blow away the enemies. It didn't work, as we know. And a more recent one, karaoke, whatever you want to pronounce it, karaoke probably. It's also completely non-transparent in English, but in Japanese, it's amazing what it originally means. It means empty orchestra. There's no orchestra, right? You're just playing it back from the CD. That's what we mentioned also when we talked about borrowing. So sometimes there's no change in meaning. Karaoke means exactly what it means. In Japanese, it means exactly what it means in English. There are karaoke bars, and it's still very popular in Japan, unlike in Europe and US, where it's losing popularity. But you can then maybe guess, because it has the same part of a compound as karaoke, karate. So it's empty. What do you think is empty in karate? It's not empty orchestra.
Fight.
Sorry?
Fight. So like empty fight.
Empty fight, okay, but empty fight in the sense, that you usually don't fight, you just train it, you're not fighting.
It's kata, because I trained karate, and kata is, you know, like fight against your imaginary opponent.
Yes. So you could actually know way more than I do, and then this could be actually a mistake in Campbell's book. So you are more qualified. But according to Campbell, the original meaning of karate is empty hand, because you are not using a sword or a weapon. But this kate that you mentioned, I'm not sure. Of course, I don't know Japanese, but kate maybe is not, I don't know. Maybe it's not related to this part ate at the end here. But that's, of course, the mystery of Japanese. Did you maybe, learn a little bit of Japanese? It's super fascinating language.
No, but this actually makes sense, because they also have kendo, which is, fighting with swords, and there is taekwondo, also fighting with swords. So it makes sense that karate is empty hand.
Yeah, those ones have this ondo at the end. Yeah. Kind of, yeah.
But for kendo, kan means sword and do means way. So everything that has do at the end means way of sword, so to say.
So you are experts on some of these things. So good to hear that. So yeah, it will be really interesting to learn a little bit of Japanese. I started learning it, but the script was the problem. They have katakana, kanji, and hiragana, and you have to learn hiragana and katakana, and you have to learn at least 350 kanji symbols before you can actually read children's books. So yeah, it's very hard. Maybe when I retire. And another great borrowing from Japanese, which is completely, again, opaque, not transparent in English, but is a perfectly sensible compound in Japanese. Can you guess it? Because Japanese seems to be so logical. What origami really means? What are you doing in origami?
Folding paper.
That's exactly what it means, to fold paper. Good job. Yeah, literally. And this is the interesting part of, borrowings, that even when they have exactly the same meaning, so we saw some examples where the meaning changed significantly. But even when you have the same meaning, you completely lose the transparency of the internal structure, which is logical. You're borrowing after all. So there are some other examples in Campbell's book, but we will not go through all of them. I will upload the presentation with additional examples. I will just focus on maybe the most interesting ones. So I would like to show you Sputnik. No, before Sputnik, cosmonaut. Cosmonaut is, of course, the Russian for astronaut. So cosmonaut in Russian is like Argonaut, somebody who sails, but he doesn't sail like a sailor, but doesn't sail the sea, sails the cosmos, the space. So it is really transparent in Russian, but not transparent in English. And in English, of course, you know that if you are a Western traveler into space, you are called astronaut. If you are from Russia, then you're a cosmonaut. To this very day, we have this difference from the Cold War retained. And from this, no, sorry, I don't know how this happened. So there's Sputnik. Now, Sputnik doesn't mean, Sputnik in English these days is like a novel device made by your opponent. It was the first object that was sent to space. It was a big victory in the Cold War and in the space race during the Cold War. But if you think about it, if I tell you that it's actually a compound consisting of a preposition and a noun, can you guess what it actually means in Russian? So,
Traveler.
yeah, follower in the travel, saputnik, exactly. So even in Serbian, we have this word, it's saputnik. It's just that we have a behind s, so saputnik. In Russian, it's saputnik, but it's the same word. It's a traveling companion, somebody who follows you in your travel, like this this garden gnome from Emily Poulain. But that, you see, it's completely lost in the borrowing. It has the association with the Cold War and the breakthrough of your enemy. Then from Spanish, no, what's wrong with my animation? Why do my slides behave the way they behave? So from Spanish, we got the word macho. And when I was still teaching with Tanya, Tanya told me that this is the only image that is good for describing a macho person. Since you speak Spanish, many of you, I know that you were, some of you were learning Spanish. Do you happen to know the original meaning in Spanish? Although these days maybe it's not maybe the primary meaning, but historically this is the meaning. It's a male animal. Macho is simply a male animal. So here you have amelioration and specialization in the borrowing process. And the similar thing happened with paella, which in Spanish is not a dish. Does anybody know what is it in Spanish? Of course, these days you can also use it as a dish, but originally it was a pot or a pan. And similarly, the most romantic dance that you can dance, tango, is simply about a drum. Yeah, there are many examples of borrowings where the meaning really changes a lot. And yeah, maybe one that is not so common in the workbooks and in the media is actually this one. No, not the slalom, which, by the way, slalom is slope plus track, so it's a track down the slope. It's completely transparent in Scandinavian languages, and it doesn't really have the meaning of skiing. It can be any track, not only a skiing track. The ombudsman is actually interesting. So it's a person appointed by the government with significant degree of independence, and this person represents the interest of the public, and this person investigates, addresses complaints, and takes care of maladministration or violation of rights by the government. But originally in Scandinavian languages, Norse languages, it's a commission man. It has nothing to do with independence representing, but some commission mans in Scandinavian countries got these roles of ombudsman. So that's how the borrowing happened. And of course, we also took that word through English probably, but fundamentally it's Scandinavian languages. So when we say Scandinavian, we mean Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. And that's it. I ran out of examples. So we can now have a lecture on contact-induced language change. So before we start, let's clarify some things right off the bat when we talk about language change, and that's the possibilities of language change. We didn't talk about it. I actually mentioned it a little bit, but if you have what you see here, the continuum of the extent to which a language can change, there are multiple possibilities to what extent you can have a language change. So you can have, and this is the most common situation, this is like in the middle, you can have language change in diverse domains. So you have changes in vocabulary, changes in phonology, changes in syntax. Of all these changes, we only didn't talk about changes in syntax, but we mention it indirectly. We'll mention it next week when we finalize with the grammaticalization. Then there's another extreme. There's virtually no change. Do no language that hasn't changed almost in any way over the last, let's say, 300 years. Even English borrowings do not exist in that language because the language commission gathers and creates a new word. They don't have computer. Almost all other languages have computer as a borrowing. This one does not.
Maybe tribal languages.
Okay, so, tribal languages, but they are really like small groups. We are talking about, you're right, so okay, tribal languages. But that's actually usually because of the lack of contact, especially those tribes that are protected and they are, our society and civilization is trying to, respect their ways with nature. But we are talking about an advanced economy. Also, the economy that was partially responsible for the big economic crisis of 2008. A small island, but a big economy. Many banks got bankrupt there in 2008. Icelandic. Did you hear about Icelandic? They have a special commission. They hate borrowings. Not that they hate. They think that they have resources in their own language that they can use to create new words. I have never talked to a person from Iceland, but based on the textbooks and scientific articles that I read, people that know way more about Icelandic than me say that if you are an educated speaker of Icelandic and you have a rich vocabulary and you know some archaic words, you can almost read Beowulf. So it's a language that's in many respects frozen in time. Another example is, but that's artificial, is the Hebrew language. It was actually retained by the religious subgroup of the Jewish community, of course. I'm talking about the rabbis. And the language spoken in Jerusalem these days is fundamentally the same language that was spoken more than 2,000 years ago. But now Hebrew is changing in contact with other languages, so this frozen in time is slightly misrepresenting the truth. And on the other extreme, guess what? You can have a language death, or you can have a replacement of a language with a more prestigious language. So we talked about these extremes, so I can run from, I can actually very quickly just give you the summary. So this is actually Icelandic, what you have here. And as you see here, it's mentioned what I mentioned. Icelandic speakers and Vikings could theoretically talk together about different things if we had a time machine. If you, if you're interested, I can add a link here that leads to a very famous website portal on IT and technology, Gizmodo, maybe you heard of it. And they have a special article on how Icelandic has the best words for technology, unique words that they created themselves. And then there's, of course, what you know from some of my other slides. There's a language whose speakers simply switch to another one. You know that. The Hebrew language. Originally, yes, these days Hebrew is the language from 2,000 and more years ago. But for many Jews, that was not the language that was their native language. They forgot their language, they gave it up and started speaking the language of their captors. So they switched to the Aramaic, which was also the language that Jesus spoke, etc. So these are the extremes. Now, the big question here is, if you forget about these extremes, what? No, my God, why or why? What causes language change? So there's a lot of research done on this. This is actually the biggest topic still open in historical linguistics and sociolinguistics as well. What exactly causes language change? But these days, most authors think that language change is actually always, in some ways, you can always deduce it or reduce it. And the bottom line is that it was caused by language contact. As soon as you have two systems that, interact, there's bound to be transfer. The question is, why do these small encounters, let's say, of, Anglo-Saxon tribes, trading fur with Norse people in the north of England, that England in let's say, in the period of King Alfred, or actually after the period of King Alfred's reign, you had like Anglo-Saxons in the south, and in the north you had the Danelaw, right? Danes, Vikings ruled the the north, the south was Anglo-Saxon. So why do these occasional encounters, you know, I give you some fur, you give me some fish, and so on, very brief encounters, how does that cause language change? How does that lead to the fact that, you know, sky, skirt, skipper, all these words are borrowed from Scandinavian, from the Norse languages? Well, there's a mathematical explanation, believe it or not. Let me show you. So, you know this, you hate mathematics, but this is intuitive. 1 to the power of 365. So that means multiply 1 365 times. What's the result? You know this, right? So 1, yeah, it's 1. It's 1. So that's fundamentally when the language is in isolation. It's not in contact with, you know, other languages. You could, that would be, let's say, the mathematical, you know, formula of one person not being in contact with any speaker of a different language. But let's say, again, mathematically, that you have this one person, but it's very rarely, 0.1. So, you know, once a month, you know, this person talks, or actually once a day for maybe 2 minutes. Once a day for 2 minutes, this person speaks to another person. That would be like 0.01 times 365. You know, they go to the market and sell fish, and they come into contact with speakers of Old Norse. Do you know what the number is if you multiply 0.01 365 times? Is it 0.011, 0.012? What does your intuition tell you? You cannot do it on a computer, by the way. You cannot do it on the calculator. You need a special calculator to do this. Well, if you said, okay, what guess? Is it under 2 or it's more than 2 as a result?
37.
Wow, you're very good. Actually, 37.78. Now, do you agree with me that this is not so intuitive? Most people, you are very good at this, but most people would not say that it's more than 2 or 3. But actually, a very small contact over a long period of time can lead to huge changes. That's the cumulative effect. You know the story also from, you know, if you are trying to improve yourselves, there are many books on habits. And there's a very popular book that's constantly on the New York Times bestseller list. It's called Atomic Habits. It's a wonderful book. And it tells you that we constantly overestimate how much we can do in a day or two, but we underestimate how much we can do over a year. So if you play the piano for only 5 or 10 minutes a day, you will learn to play better than if you try to learn to play the piano over 2 days constantly. Simply doesn't work like that. So this is actually this continuous effect. Now, let's say that there's 1.02. So there's just a little bit more of contact. Is this now more than 100, maybe 300? What does your intuition tell you? So this is another small, you know, small interaction, but over every single day. Mathematically speaking, that's the counterpart of somebody being exposed to another language for a very small amount of time, but every single day. A very small change, right? From 0.01 to 0.02. Believe it or not, the number is neither 100, 300, or anything like that. It's 1,377.41. And now let's imagine that instead of, you know, this close encounter for a minute, like, here's the fish, here's the fur, good job, see you tomorrow. Let's say that you actually end up trying to talk to that person. So over periods, long periods of time, you constantly get into more and more interaction, and you try to somehow communicate. So let's say that instead of a minute or 2 minutes every day, you try to speak for 10 or 15 minutes, and you're in that kind of contact with other language system. Let's represent it with 1.07 to the power of 365. Can you guess the number? Is it more than 10,000 or maybe under 10,000?
More.
More, way more. Here you are. I won't keep you waiting. This is the number. It's actually, I don't know even how to pronounce it. It's trillions. I think it's 53. No, it's no, billion. Sorry. It's 53 billion 98 million, something like that. Huh? So what I'm trying to say, and what the mathematics and new linguistics insight that take into consideration the duration of time and employ actually some language, statistic and mathematics, tell us that the importance of small but continuous contact with other systems, we actually tend to neglect it. We think it's not important. But also from everyday life that they tell you, for example, just exercising for 15 minutes a day can extend your lifetime by several years. So these small events over long periods of time have a huge cumulative effect. And if you want to improve your life, it's actually about introducing those positive habits that last only 5 minutes, but that's a completely different story. So this is actually the explanation why language contact is so powerful. Because when you think about it, small changes, now we know it also mathematically, and we know that this applies also to human interactions, can have huge effects over long and longer periods of time. And there's no other language that can provide a better insight into what can happen through constant contact with other languages than English. English is a case study, a perfect example of everything that can happen. It's like one of the most extreme languages in terms of what happened to it. And these days, we think that all the things that happen to it are actually due to language contact. So we think that language contact is the key to language change. And what you are going to hear now is not, let's say, still considered, let's call it, the well-established opinion by the majority of historical linguists. This is considered a relatively avant-garde approach, but this approach is becoming more and more accepted throughout the linguistic society. And if you want to find out more about it, most of the remaining lecture is based and adapted from our magnificent bastard tongue. It's the Untold History of English by John McWhirter. John McWhirter also has a podcast. He's a very famous linguist. And as far as I know, he's the only linguist who actually appeared on all 3 late night shows that really matter. So John McWhirter was a guest of Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel, and the other Jimmy, what's the other Jimmy? Jimmy Fallon. But despite his popularity, John McWhirter, who's, by the way, a very, not Scottish person, he's an African American, so don't be surprised if you go to YouTube, try to find John McWhirter, he's an African American. So this is still considered by some, especially, backward looking linguists, it's what you're going to hear is slightly controversial, like stem cell research, euthanasia, gun control, etc. But it is a very different perspective at the development of English, because now, thanks to advances in linguistics, DNA, scientific calculations on large corpora, so now we have much more tools at our disposal. Now we think that we now finally know the truth, but some people don't want to see that truth because they are still captured in their old ways. And the old ways means that you always look from one single perspective. So if you look at this circular, object, three-dimensional, and if you look it from the side, you will say that you are looking at a shadow of a square. If you're looking at it from, from the other perspective, you may think it's just, it's a circle, but it's actually a three-dimensional object, and the truth is only visible when you look at one and the same thing from multiple perspectives and use insights from all those multiple perspectives. So why do we say that English is an example of radical changes due to language contact? We have to look at English grammar. And what do we know about changes in English grammar? What's the grand old history of English? So the saga tells us that the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes invaded the British Isles, and they brought Old English, and then came some new words. Originally, until the 9th century, we only had Anglo-Saxon words. Then, starting from the 9th century, because of the Danelaw, and this what I just talked about, Anglo-Saxon, first fur trader selling fur to Old Norse fishermen. We got some Old Norse words like sky, for example. Then, of course, after 2 centuries, William the Bastard came, brought French with him. So starting from 11th century, we have Norman French and new words from French. Then in the 15th century, we are starting to again think about science. Religion is using its grip on the society, and Latin becomes important. And the history of English, when you look at the books of English, is about layering of words. What made it possible in English to have so many different, related words for the same concept? So ask is Old English, question is Old French, interrogate is Latin. They're fundamentally the same. But in English, you have this layering. The same applies to hospital, hostel, and hotel. They are, again, from different languages. Hospital is Latin, hostel is Old French, hotel is modern French. So the history of English, according to most stories of the history of English, is about English borrowing many words in different periods, also having some phonological changes along the way. But fundamentally, the whole story of English is about English being so open to many other words. Did you hear anything throughout your studies of English about the changes in the grammar of English? Or were you constantly talking about sound changes and new words? Come on, don't be shy.
Well, word order was fixed.
Did they explain why? Yeah, okay, yeah, that's one of the things that they mentioned, that grammar underwent simplification and the order in the sentence, the word order, became fixed. But is it really possible, when you think about it, that these borrowings and lexical invasion, because English was so open to other words, that it somehow led to the new form of the English language? You know, they try to explain this, then say they give examples. They say, you know, English, never tried to create its own words. You know, Greek compound oxus cross glenan, sour material, Sauerstoff. In English, it's simply oxygen from Greek. Helios, helium. So it was unlike German. But can this really be true? Can lexical borrowings shape the language? You can guess that my and John McWhirter's idea is that it's not true. But in order to prove that it's not true, let's look at other languages. Let's look at languages that also were in contact and borrowed heavily. Languages like contact. So, as we mentioned, there are very few extremes. There are very few languages that did not change at all. And they usually either did it artificially or they live without contact to other communities. But languages like contact. And whenever languages come into contact, they exchange words. So, for example, I don't know if you know this, but according to Campbell and also John McWhirter, more than half the words in Japanese are Chinese. And you know that also Japanese people, if they know all the signs in kanji, can understand the gist of Chinese newspapers. And the same applies to Chinese, you know, educated people. They can get the gist of Japanese newspaper. Urdu is almost half Persian and Arabic, not natively Urdu. In our neighborhood, Albanian is actually more than 60% Greek, Latin, Romanian, Turkish, Serbian, and Macedonian. Only 40% of Albanian words are considered to be native Albanian words. None of these languages, like English, is celebrated for its openness to words from other languages. But what's really important here is that despite the fact that the vocabulary system of these languages is similar to the English system, that more than 50% of words are borrowed, none of these languages change their structure from the earliest records to the present day as much as Old English did to present day English. Yet, according to most textbooks, the difference between Old English and Modern English is just a whole lot of new words, some new pronunciation, and the language also developed these new grammatical forms, but we mention it. But it's nothing in comparison to the lexical influx and sound changes. It just happened. So don't get me wrong, words are nice. I'm not, against looking at lexical, semantic changes, phonological changes. So, it's really interesting to see what we were looking at before. But most of the books on the history of the English language are actually based on etymology and this descriptive approach. John McWhirter is slightly politically incorrect. He calls it the word fetish approach. That it means that most linguists, when they were looking at the history of English, ignored non-words. They ignored syntactic changes, syntactic features, new patterns in syntax, etc., which fundamentally means that you are ignoring not the elephant, but the gorilla in the room. This is a big problem, how to, how to make the pension system sustainable throughout the world. That's also the gorilla in the room. So the problem with that, again, John McWhirter's term, the fetish approach, is that you learn that English lost a bit of this, gained a bit of that, but you miss the larger picture. And the larger picture is that to compare to how languages typically change over time, English lost an amazingly vast, perplexingly vast amount of grammar. But what is even bigger picture is that English grammar, the grammar that English took on, and that is, for example, the ing, do support, and some other things, it seems ordinary only because we like English and because we speak English. The biggest picture is that the things that English took on when it lost its original grammar, those things are so weird when you compare it to all other Germanic languages. And for example, from Serbian, Serbian was under the influence, heavy influence of Turkish for more than 5 centuries. But the syntax of Serbian did not change considerably. You didn't lose all the cases. You didn't suddenly become, from a syntactic language, analytic language with a fixed word order. So what does this, when I say weird grammar, mean? Really, what is weird in grammar? For example, if you're talking about animals, this would be weird, a combination of a shark and a horse. Shorse, let's say. So let me explain. And in order to explain, we have to look at the English and its bloodline, the English language and its bloodline. You know that it's actually a Germanic language, a West Germanic language. So its, closest relatives are German, of course, Dutch, Yiddish, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic, which we talked about, plus some less familiar languages like Faroese, Frisian, Afrikaans. And as you also know from our previous lectures, the parent of all these languages was spoken roughly 25 centuries ago in what is now, let's say, Denmark, we think, and that was Proto-Germanic. So all these languages should be almost identical when you look at their deeper syntactic structures. It should be visible just when you look at Russian and Serbian, or Polish and Slovenian and Serbian, that they are all Slavic, languages with similar suffixes, similar words, etc. And in all of these languages, except English, you actually can see that. You can see that they are very similar. It's clear from first from their words. So North Germanic language, the vocabulary of that language is as mixed as the vocabulary of English. So German word for entrance is Eingang, Dutch is Ingang, Swedish is Ingang, Yiddish is Aringanga, Icelandic Inganga, English is entrance. Before the invasion of those words that we talked about, English actually had Ingang, but then it took entrance from French. But most importantly, it's not just words. It's also variations in terms of grammar that are almost identical across all these relatives of German. So if you know Darwin's theory of evolution, and he talked about finches, so when you look at most Germanic languages and you look at their grammar patterns, you know that they are the same thing, like those finches that Darwin wrote about, or you may and the same applies to languages in other groups within the Indo-European family. So French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, you can immediately see that they are related to Latin originally. English is the only exception. English is actually the oddball. We think it's normal because we love it, but English is actually completely weird. And you can see that it's weird, and this is the example taken from John McWhirter's book. If you make a sentence, not a particularly nice sentence, but you make a sentence that, all the words in the sentence are native words. This is, by the way, how Churchill wrote his speeches. He tried to only use Anglo-Saxon words that made his speeches powerful. So, did she say to my daughter that my father has come alone and is feeling better? It's not a particularly nice sentence in English, but in German, it would be something like, sagte sie meiner Tochter, dass mein Vater allein gekommen ist und sich besser fühlt. If you don't speak German, this means, said she to my daughter that my father alone, past participle of come, is, and himself better feels. So I color-coded this. Do notice the amount of difference that we are looking at. We think it's normal, but we think it's normal simply because it's English. We know how it works. No other Germanic language uses do support. Like all Indo-European languages, Serbian included, we use the inversion. Sagte sie. Reče li on da će doći? Did she say is what we use in English. We have do support. Then look at this, meine Tochter, my daughter. You have no suffixes, you use preposition plus the determiner to indicate what was originally the case marking. Then notice that has come is something that in English is realized, in German is realized through gekommen ist. And notice the word order. In English, it is auxiliary plus the main verb. In German, if you speak German, you know that this is normal in German and most Germanic languages. You have the participle and then the auxiliary. And then notice, and this again applies to Serbian as well, there is no progressive verbal construction. We use present simple plus some adverbials to denote what in English we express through the progressive aspect. So this is really, the best insight that you can see that you can get into how different English actually is to its closest relative. The big question is, so everything that I also mentioned here is explained in these animations, but then you look at other languages, and I don't want to pronounce this, I will read it the way it's written. That's terrible probably, but I don't want to do it. But if you look at this they, sie, tegen, min, dochter, it's very similar to German. Dat mean vader, father, allein gekommen ist, that's why this German allein gekommen ist, and sich better mean kommet alene og får sig bedre. That's Norwegian. Again, that's not how you pronounce it. So this looks very much like German, but none of that looks like English, right? So the big question is not then, why Germanic languages developed the way they did. No, the big question is actually why English developed the way it did. Why is it indeed so silly in English alone to say, said she to my daughter that my father alone come is and himself better feels? It sounds terrible, but it's only terrible in English. You should be able to say it in English, but you cannot say. Why? Because, you know, we don't know why, but I will tell you, of course, and John McWhirter will tell you, because this is all based on his book and research. So you should be able to say that because they're all based on Proto-Germanic. But it's only English speakers that say that this is not okay. So there's something very different about how English evolved. So I will extend the lecture for 10 or 15 minutes and then we will stop because it's close to the end. I don't have so many slides remaining. This is no longer just John McWhirter's theory. So there's a large growing group of linguists, both historical sociolinguists, historical linguists, sociolinguists, and also linguists that deal with big data set and analyze historical corpora, that say that this answer that you're going to hear is actually the right answer. So this peculiarity of English is not an accident. There are reasons that are very obvious when you look at them properly, but those reasons are lost in chronicles of English history that are grounded in words, and then some more words. So those peculiarities of English are these. So first of all, it's grammar. English grammar is so much less complicated than the grammar of German or Norwegian or Icelandic or any Germanic language. So the grammar is immensely simplified. On top of that, unlike any Germanic language, English has do support in questions, like why does English use do in questions? It's a normal question in English, only in English. Also, unlike all its Germanic relatives, English has progressive constructions. He's feeling better, where all other Germanic languages use the present simple plus adverb. He feels better. And actually, so do almost all languages in the world. So in order to get to the answer why that happened, why it's not an accident, you have to also ask additional questions. Is there any other language or other languages that have both do support? You remember this lecture is about contact. So maybe you can explain this through contact. Do you have languages that have do support and ing construction? So progressive and do support. Come on. Of course, we love English, but do you know any languages like that? If you look at Serbian, we have none. If you look at, you know, Germanic, except English, no other Germanic language has it. Other Slavic languages do not have it. Hungarian and Finnish and Ugro-Finnic groups really also do not have it. So any ideas? Do you know maybe? Well, if you knew, you would be able to dismantle this theory, but most likely you don't know any such language, because linguists who deal with the typologies of language found just several examples, that means under 10 examples out of 6,000 languages in the world. Do support and ing together are so rare that you will really, you really are looking for a needle in a haystack if you want to find these features in other languages. And the second question, so the answer to the first question is there are only a couple of languages. I didn't tell you which ones, but that's the big reveal. The second question is, are there other languages whose grammar has undergone a simplification of this or a comparably high degree? English is an extreme. Very few languages have undergone such simplification, but there are languages, and you know them. you dealt with them in at least 2 courses. Do you know? Languages that are the product of contact through and then result in huge simplification of their syntax and morphology. Come on, you know this from the first year. Anybody? Okay. So Creoles. The answer to both questions is yes. The first question, the right answer is Welsh and Cornish languages have do support, and they have ing. Those languages were spoken in Britain long before English, for more than 1500 years together with English, and they have do and ing. And Creoles are examples of this simplification. So this is the text from taken from John McWhirter's book. The Scandinavian Vikings did more than leave us with words like skirt, sky, and get. They also beat up the English language in the same way that English children beat up foreign languages in classrooms. And 1200 years later, we are still speaking their close but no cigar rendition of Old English. What he's aiming at is that in language context situations, especially when Anglo-Saxon tribes spoke to Vikings, what happens, for example, when you speak to a speaker of Slovenian or Macedonian. You try to use very simple sentences, the roots of the words which are common to all or both languages. So you actually create a simplification. This is normal. This is what happens always when two related languages come into contact. You use simple words, you use simple constructions, you simplify things. But that explains the simplification. What explains do support and ing is that while Vikings were mangling English syntax, and simplifying it, Welsh and Cornish were seasoning these changes. So Welsh and Cornish influenced the introduction of do support and ing construction. So this Viking and Welsh and Cornish edition of English is what we have today. It's a hybrid language. And that language we speak today, it's called English. But for hundreds of years, although the evidence was always there, nobody actually dared to say something like that, because, English was the language of the empire that rules the world and all the seas over which the sun never sets. How can you claim that the language of that empire is a Creole that was, hybridized through the influence of the Celts and the influence of the Vikings? It's completely, you lose your face as an empire if you say something like that. So story of English is not story of words. What happened to vocabulary? Actually, the real story of English is about what other languages did to English grammar. And the real story of English is what happened when Old English was bettered by Vikings and simultaneously, these are McWhirter's words, bastardized by Celts. So Celtic languages are actually very important in the history of English, but it was not polite to talk about that because it was considered that, this never happened. Most linguists call it the hidden Celtic legacy. So let's look at do support. So Celtic languages in the British Isles, like Cornish, which died, Welsh and Pictish also died, had some very interesting peculiarities. First of all, they were verb-first languages. That was extremely rare and it is still extremely rare among Indo-European languages. And this is do support in Welsh. If you say, did I open? You say nesi agor. I did not open. Nesi didim agor. I opened nesi agor. So what you should notice here, and that's actually quite important, is that these Celtic languages constantly have do support. Even in declarative sentences, you use do. So you know, you are exposed to this feature that you should use the auxiliary words for all constructions. And you may ask, like, okay, but did English ever display similar syntactic behavior? It did. In Middle English, you can find examples like thou dudest vepe, which meant you wept. In Shakespeare, in Hamlet, you can find things like, alas, how's it with you that you do bend your eye on vacancy, and with the incorporeal air do hold discourse. From this perspective, you may think, okay, but Shakespeare was just putting it there like we put it today to emphasize, like, he does love you. But it was actually quite common. And it is quite common also in situations where it's obvious that the speaker is not emphasizing anything. So even in the times of Shakespeare, there was still a lot of evidence that do support, and do was used even in declarative sentences. So in other words, Middle English and even early modern English was much more similar to Welsh and Cornish than the present day Germanic. And in Celtic, you also have the peculiar way of expressing activity in progress, again from Welsh. Mai mairi kinu, let's say, is Mary in singing. This kanu is not a verb. It's not a verb as in she's singing. It's a gerund, like when you say singing is a nice artistic activity. Do you have something similar in English? It did exist. It existed in Old English, which had only two tenses, present and preterite. So it had to be creative to express activity in progress. So in Old English, you would say he was on huntende, which meant he was on hunting. And this was a noun. Huntende was a noun. In Old English, towards the end of this period, late Old English, it changed to vere du today on huntunge. So were you today on hunting? But it was still considered a noun. We know that because of grammatical concord and research on Old English. In early modern English, it changed to were you today on hunting? And this a was usually not pronounced. And later in early modern English, it changed were you towards the end of Middle English, it sounded like were you today a hunting? That's still Middle English. And in present day English, you say were you hunting today? So what you see here is actually the change of this noun, which was also the same construction, you remember, that was used in Celtic languages, but it got grammaticalized into the progressive construction. So you can spend days, months, years, decades flipping through the books written before 2008 on the history of English language, trying to find the influence of Celtic languages, and you will find nothing except place names. You can also spend the same amount of time trying to find an explanation of how do support appeared in English. And you will find no real explanation, but occasionally somebody may mention that Celtic languages maybe are passable influence, not significant. The problem why you have this, why this is the case, is that It's not the problem that all those legions of scholars who wrote this are incompetent, stubborn, bigoted. The problem is that they had certain well-established assumptions, and nobody was comfortable in, not following these assumptions, because these assumptions were that English and Celtic similarities are accidents, coincidences. So this first assumption why this was treated like that is that the Celts just conveniently all died. That's the first reason why you will never hear about, the influence of Celts. And do you know where this assumption comes from? Who is responsible for the assumption that Celts just died? Anybody?
Maybe the crown itself, they figured it was the best way to protect themselves and their language.
Okay, you're on the right track, but it wasn't really the crown, because the crown was, okay, they were the rulers, but the real rulers of, let's say, the society were the monks, the priests, the church. So the assumption that Celts just died and that they were subjugated, that they were conquered and slaughtered by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, comes from Venerable Bede. So Venerable Bede was speaking about the Anglo-Saxon invasion of the British Isles 3 centuries after those events. That's like, for example, today you decide to write about 18th century, early 18th century Serbia. And you base, at the time, no records, almost no records, nothing. You ask other people, like, what are the stories, what happened 300 years ago? You ask your great-grandmother, like, what did you hear from your great-grandparents? What happened back then? That's how Venerable Bede wrote about Anglo-Saxons and Jutes invading the British Isles. And his assumption was, and this was the assumption, that Anglo-Saxons and Jutes in their, couple of dozens of ships conquered the British Isles and slaughtered all the Celts. That's not possible. Even today, with, weapons of mass destruction, you cannot conduct that, that kind of a genocide, because Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were outnumbered 3 to 100. In terms of, the population. And also, this assumption is wrong, because today they did DNA analysis, and you can reconstruct the migrations and etc. Only 4% of British men are actually Anglo-Saxons and Jutes coming from the North Sea region. 96% of DNA of British men is Celtic, and 99% of English women are Celtic in their DNA. That's an inconvenient truth that no British nationalist will ever tell you. It took an American, John McWhirter, to actually publicly start talking about DNA findings, which are not so nice to mention, and on top of that, there are no archaeological pieces of evidence that Germanic invaders managed to slaughter hundreds of thousands of Celts. There are no abrupt changes in material evidence, burial sites, etc. So Celts actually lived in huge numbers alongside Germanic invaders. They were their slaves, their servants, their farmers, their serfs, and they talk together. When people, work together, they talk together, and when they talk different languages, languages mix. And what is most important, women who were in charge of kids, you know, these let's call them you know, early au pairs, they were really, you know, Celts, and the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. All the songs, all the, you know, let's say these I don't know what to call it, but things like "Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo," we mentioned it in the first lecture, that had to come from the Celts. There's no other way where other you know, language where it could have come from. It doesn't exist in any other you know, branch of the Indo-European tribes. This "Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo," it has no meaning in Germanic languages whatsoever. So that's what happened. The Celts were there. DNA evidence shows that they are still there. They just now call themselves, you know, Britons or you know, Englishmen. And also archaeology tells us that they are there. And the second problematic assumption, and this is not the fault of linguists, it was just, you know, that throughout the development of linguistics, it was always focused on words. And it was simply assumed that, you know, changes in grammar simply happen for no particular reason. So now we know that it's not true. Modern genetics, like the National Geographic and IBM product on genographics, the Genographic project, that traces the history of migrations and the composition of populations, shows what I just mentioned. So you have it here. I was running ahead of myself. Only 4% of British men have genetic material of Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. British women have no DNA of Anglo-Saxons and Jutes whatsoever, you know, statistically negligible. You find, you know, burial sites facing northeast. That's the Celtic style, where people were buried crouching, and you find it well into even the Norman period. So, you know, like 600 or 700 years after the Anglo-Saxon conquest. So all those traditional assumptions are wrong. And if you look carefully, you see, like in, for example, historical documents like Ine of Essex laws. Ine was actually an Anglo-Saxon ruler. He made separate provisions for English and British subjects. British subject, that's Welsh, that means slaves. And those documents show, and this is 7th and 8th century, that the western part of Essex was very thinly settled by Germanic newcomers. So there was a huge population of the Celts. And even if you don't believe DNA, even if you don't believe these rare historical documents that survived and show that there were Celts there, even today with the latest weapons, it would be impossible to conduct a genocide of almost 1 million people and leave no burial sites from that period, so that you can see these mass burial sites. The problem is Venerable Bede. Venerable Bede, who was writing 3 centuries after the events about the actual events. And David Crystal repeats it, etc. And all other major British linguists repeat this idea that Celtic was insignificant, not important at all, but they forget that languages mix when they come together. And there is no recorded case in human history when that did not happen. And this happened to Old English, and this gave birth to English as we know it today. So what I just told you with 25 minutes over time is Celtic hypothesis. This is what it's known, Celtic hypothesis. 10 years ago, if you said something like this at a conference or even whispered it among, you know, established linguists, you could have risked your career. These days, things are changing. And for example, in these books, Early Germanic Languages in Contact, Language Contact and the Origins of the Germanic Languages, you actually have this hypothesis neatly supported with additional examples, way more than I mentioned here. And for example, there's also this book by Derek Bickerton about bastard tongues, and shows how Creoles are actually not that uncommon, and that many languages that we think are, you know, like standard languages that follow the standard development are actually Creoles. So this is, you know, the story of English grammar. It is not about, you know, something happening out of the blue for no reason because you were borrowing too many words, because in no other language that borrows so many words, you have this way of this amount of simplification. It was actually about creolization, hybridization, and lexical borrowing. So it was like a three-pronged, you know, attack on the original form of the English language that gave us what we have today, and that's modern English. And it's supported, this hypothesis today. Actually, the best evidence is DNA. You know, they didn't kill them all. No, Celts are, you know, having their revenge these days because DNA evidence is super conclusive. 0 women and 90% men in the British Isles are actually Celtic in their DNA. So that's, you know, for everybody who's not a bigot and British nationalist, that's enough. Any questions? We flipped the class, first the practice, now the lecture. Did you hear this approach to the development of English? Do you find it interesting, although albeit controversial? Any thoughts, or you're too tired? Okay. If you have no further comments or questions, then I will just tell you that occasionally there's a question on this in the written exam. And the question is, what is the Celtic hypothesis? And your answer should be the Celtic hypothesis is a new hypothesis about the development of English grammar, which is based on archaeological DNA and DNA evidence, which shows that the Celtic languages, together with the Old Norse, exerted a strong influence of Old English. The Old Norse influence was about simplification of grammar, whereas the Celtic influence was about due support and the progressive constructions. Together, these two separate directions of contact-induced change produced a hybrid Creole language that we know as English. And that's it. And that's the only hypothesis right now that really explains why do support and ing and simplification occurred. Everything else just assumes that things happened. That's no, you don't have to write that. That's just my comment on this. So, you know, in 5 or 10 years, this will probably be almost, you know, I hope, a dominant explanation. But these days, there are still many old British historical linguists who simply do not want to accept the facts. But the facts are great. So if you want to find out more, this Bastard Tongues is a great book. And of course, the book on which I based my entire lecture are Magnificent Bastard Tongue. It was one of the best sellers when it was published more than a decade ago, I think. as judged by the New York Times bestseller list, of course, in the fiction section. Okay, so if there are no further comments, don't forget, you have a template for your second assignment. You have more than a month to finish it. It's all about analogical change, borrowing, and semantic change. So you have to give an example of analogical change, any kind of analogical change, just one example for a change of your choice. The same applies to semantic change. And you use examples from your native tongue, because the assumption is you know more about your native tongue in a way than you know about subtle differences in meaning and changes in English. And you also give one example for each of the three main causes of borrowing, and that's prestige, that's negative evaluation, and of course the most common one, need. That's it. Check also the Excel sheet about the pass grades. You are the first generation where everybody passed. Good work, good job. If you are not on the list, then there was something wrong in Google Drive, and then just send me an email and we'll try to resolve the situation. And I'm stopping the recording. So